The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Sovereign God, raise your throne in our hearts. Created by you, let us live in your image. Created for you, let us act for your glory. Redeemed by you, let us give you what is yours. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. That will be the collect for 29th lectionary in year A. So today we're going to look, after setting the groundwork last week, on an analysis of the economy or the market. And people that are writing about this are using capital letters for those when they're speaking of this topic that we're talking about. The market, capital T, capital M. The economy, capital E. And more people, there's a bunch of writing out on this, more than several books, essays, articles, are recognizing that the economy or the market, and not just limited, when I use the market and when others do, it isn't just limited to the stock market. That's just one piece of it, but the whole enterprise that normally gets lumped into the category of the free market, basically. This whole idea has shifted in the past couple centuries from something that serves people and helps us work together, provides goods and services, a servant, basically, to something that is now treated as the one served, a deity or a god. And it sounds a little drastic, but what's interesting is last week when I said that, clearly there were some of you that hadn't read that or thought of that before, because there was a significant murmur and a ooh. So it hit home, didn't it? I mean, the first time I heard it, I thought, oh, they're onto something here. There is truth going on here to that. So maybe it isn't as drastic if it strikes that kind of a chord among us, even if we haven't thought about it before. But we need to get into the idea as good Lutherans, so we're going to start with Martin Luther. And we're going to figure out what Luther said a God was. So here's the time. If anybody wants to stand up and recite from memory as you did at your confirmation. Well, that's okay. I'll put it up there and save you the time. So here's what Luther writes. Here's what Luther writes in the large catechism about the commandments, the first commandment. So the first commandment, you are to have no other gods. Luther writes, that is, you are to regard me alone as your God. What does this mean? And how is it to be understood? What does to have a God mean? Or what is God? Answer, good Lutheran thing. A God is that to which we are to look for all good, and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God is nothing else than to believe and trust in that one with your whole heart. As I have often said, it is the truth and trust and faith, the trust and faith of the heart alone that make both God and an idol. Anything on which your heart relies and depends, I say, that is really your God. So this seems relatively straightforward, doesn't it? I mean, who in our lives is the highest good? Who is the one whom we expect will care for us when we're old or sick, when we're afraid? Who's the one that looks out for our needs and helps us with them? Most of us would like to say the triune God. In our hearts we believe that God is the center of our faith. I think we can convince ourselves that that's true. But I wonder if the way we view money and the market and free enterprise and all of that suggests that in truth we might trust in God, but we really trust more in our pension. We might look to God for help, but it's our insurance that we rely on in time of need. We might think that God is the one that provides, but money is sure handy down here, as George Bailey says to the angel in It's a Wonderful Life. Comes in pretty handy down here, bub. That's one of my favorite lines in the whole. So this isn't mutually exclusive, but as I said last week, over a century ago, Lutherans had a serious debate over whether insurance was permissible for people of faith, whether you were really trusting in God. So Luther's point is, be as honest as we can about our motivations. That's what that insurance debate of over a century ago was about. What are we really saying when we buy insurance? So Luther says, know your motivations, know your trust, know how you make decisions. One way we could test our loyalty, trust, and faith is to ask the obedience question, I think. To whom can we not say no? Whose word demands obedience from us without questioning, without thought. We are really, really good at parsing God's commands, figuring out how it might not be exactly what we thought we were supposed to be doing. But are we that good at parsing what money demands of us? If our decisions are more driven by what makes sense financially for us than by what God might ask of us, that might be a sign that we're on a path that we don't want to be in. So I'm going to look at the next piece that Luther says, because I think he sort of puts it in different words, and I thought it would be worth just continuing to read in the Large Catechism a moment. Luther writes, "The intention of this commandment, therefore, is to require true faith and confidence of the heart, which fly straight to the one true God and cling to God alone. What this means is, see to it that you let me alone be your God and never search for another. In other words, whatever good thing you lack, look to me for it, seek it from me, and whenever you suffer misfortune and distress, crawl to me and cling to me. I myself will give you what you need and help you out of every danger. Only do not let your heart cling to or rest in anyone else." Where your heart clings to and rests in really resonates with me. By the way, if those of you that really have the Large Catechism memorized, this is actually Timothy Weingert's newer translation in the recent edition of Book of Concord that came out when? Dwight knows. 2000, so 17 years, but if you grew up on Tappert, you might say, well, it isn't worded exactly as how I memorized it. Can I just tell you, though, that I'm giving you a great deal of credit that anybody here has memorized the entire Large Catechism. God bless. So here's the interesting thing. So Luther has said, where is your heart clinging? Where does your heart rest? And what is his first example? His first example that he gives is money. He gives other ones, but the first example is money. He writes, "So that it may be understood and remembered, I must explain this a little more plainly by citing some everyday examples of the opposite." So, this is the first everyday example. There are some who think that they have God and everything they need when they have money and property. They trust in them and boast in them so stubbornly and securely that they care for no one else. They too have a God, Mammon by name. That comes from Matthew 6:24. That is money and property, on which they set their whole heart. This is the most common idol on earth. Those who have money and property feel secure, happy, and fearless, as if they were sitting in the midst of paradise. On the other hand, those who have nothing doubt and despair, as if they knew of no God at all. We will find very few who are cheerful, who do not fret and complain if they do not have mammon. This desire for wealth clings and sticks to our nature all the way to the grave. Now this is 500 years ago, and Luther's already picking up on the threat of wealth to move into the place of divinity in our lives. His analysis is similar to the one Jesus makes, and we're going to see that next week. We're going to look a lot more at Jesus' commands and the trouble Jesus has with money in our lives. It's very important to keep what Luther is saying in mind, but I want to suggest that the shift that we're seeing now in this beginning of the 21st century, I guess we're almost a quarter of the way through it, or working that way, is that it's more than just, who's my God in my heart? Who's your God in your heart? Luther, I don't think, could have grasped the systemic God that wealth has become. What has changed is wealth is now centered around a system that is so large and beyond our control that it actually can act like a God. And not surprisingly, we mostly acquiesce to its power and might. And so I'm going to ask you to bear with me, because we're going to shift from a teacher of the church 500 years ago to a teacher of the church today, Pope Francis. And I'm actually going to read something extensive from his reading. And so it's not the best teaching methodology, but I kept looking at this and saying, you're not going to be able to summarize this better than the Pope writes it. And so I'm going to read through 3 little sections, they're little in scope of the big thing, of his encyclical Evangelii Gaudium, The Joy of the Gospel, which was the first one that he produced after his election as Pope. But what Francis does is take Luther's insight and expand it to the systemic use of wealth and the free market and how we view it in this country. And one of the things that the Pope is going to introduce, we're not going to get to in depth today, we'll get to in depth next week, and that is the contrast with God's view of wealth, which always needs to serve the poor. And that flows throughout the Pope's encyclical here, this section of it. So we're not leaving that alone. We'll get back to that next week when we actually say, so what does God say to us? This week, what I want to do is just lay out what seems to be the realities in which we live. So here's what Pope Francis writes. Just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say thou shalt not to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? This is a case of exclusion. Can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Human beings are themselves considered consumer goods, to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture which is now spreading. It is no longer simply about exploitation and oppression, but something new. Exclusion ultimately has to do with what it means to be a part of the society in which we live. Those excluded are no longer society's underside, or its fringes, or its disenfranchised. They are no longer even a part of it. The excluded are not the exploited, but the outcast, the leftovers. In this context, the Pope writes, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. I added the italics for that. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. This is the first hint in this section on wealth, where the Holy Father introduces the idea of some divinity behind this, or at least how we treat the system, the sacralized workings of it. He's going to explore that a little further, but first let me read the next thing that comes, where he identifies our enslavement to this. To sustain a lifestyle, he writes, which excludes others, or to sustain enthusiasm for that selfish ideal, a globalization of indifference has developed. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, and feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. So, what this leads the Pope to say is, here's the faith problem behind this. It's our relationship with money that causes the problem. So he goes on to say this. One cause of this situation is found in our relationship with money, since we calmly accept its dominion over ourselves and our societies. The current financial crisis can make us overlook the fact that it originated in a profound human crisis, the denial of the primacy of the human person. We're going to get more to the change that we now have with person is now corporation, and not just in that Supreme Court ruling, but the Pope is already leaning towards that. So he goes on to say this, we have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf, Exodus 32, 1-35, has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and the economy lays bare their imbalances and above all their lack of real concern for human beings. Man, he writes, is reduced to one of his needs alone, consumption. This impersonal economy that doesn't care about humanity is going to be a theme that we need to pay attention to throughout all of this and understand, what does that mean for us? Because the economy in which we live doesn't care about people. It cares about profit. And we participate in it sometimes unwittingly, sometimes wittingly. Someone said to me last week, the real reality is there is probably no ethical way to consume anything. I mean, there's, I talked about tea last week. The whole system is geared not to help people, but to make profit. And that means that the last concern is who is getting stepped on and what is happening. And the Pope picks up on that. But I want to look at this golden calf idea a little bit. If you remember the story of the Israelites, it's a really interesting sophistry that they do there as they're trying to explain what they all did. When Aaron makes the golden calf, they don't say that they've abandoned the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What they say is, these are the gods that led us out of Egypt. So they recognize that a God saved them from slavery and brought them through the wilderness. But what they say is, this is the one who did it. So they don't really see a dissociation between the unseen God, who only Moses can hear, and that's a problem for them, by the way. A few chapters before Exodus 32, they ask Moses, we'd like to hear ourselves. Moses sets it all up, they clean themselves up, they have 3 days, but when God actually speaks, they're all terrified, and they say, no, we take it back. You listen to God before. But Moses is the only one that can see and hear God. And so what they claim is, the God they've been following all along is this golden calf. And that, I think, is the frightening thing about it. They'd already fallen into idolatry, and they have abandoned the God who led them out of slavery in Egypt. But the trap is telling yourself you're not. Telling yourself, this isn't affecting my faith, this doesn't change what I believe about God, but this is whom I will now listen to, this golden calf. So do we assume that the one who really gives life, who saves us, is the economy, the market, rather than the triune God whose Son died and rose to give us life, who entered our suffering and our world and our very bodies, and now draws us into life now and forever? So that's really what's at stake. Exposing how we see the free market and the economy as God doesn't give us all the answers. And next week we're going to work through, maybe, are there answers here? But at least we have to have, Luther would say, the honesty to know where we're standing and who it is we look to for our deepest need. So we finish up with Francis's quote. While the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, oh wait, I want to click this one out so you can see it. While the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. And did I put it yet? So these italics are mine as well. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. What you'll notice is there's tons of atheists that are criticizing people of faith. Books are written, essays are said, why our faith is problematic. No one challenges, well, not no one, because people are starting to, but in general, no one challenges the God of the market. You don't get to say the market doesn't get to say what it does. This absolute autonomy where there is no criticism permitted of the God of the market, because it's whatever, you're either unpatriotic or you are unrealistic or whatever. It is just, this God broaches no critics. So, back to the Pope. Consequently, these ideologies, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. A new tyranny is thus born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. Debt and the accumulation of interest also make it difficult for countries to realize the potential of their own economies and keep citizens from enjoying their real purchasing power. To all this we can add widespread corruption and self-serving tax evasion, which have taken on worldwide dimensions. The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits. In this system, which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which become the only rule. I am glad that you let me do that. What were you going to do, walk out? But I really wanted you to hear that whole piece. I am so grateful for a Christian leader who speaks out about this so clearly, and there's so much truth in this. When I was reading through this, I was saying, this is what frustrates me so much in the news. When we talk about the markets, when we talk about money, when we talk about finances, it's just impossible to say, well, wait a minute, how is this affecting the poor people? Wait a minute, how is this affecting the economy of this little town? Wait a minute. Well, it doesn't matter because we've got to make money and we're going to sell national parks and we're going to do whatever we need to do because profit is everything. And the Holy Father has suggested that's a pretty good indicator then who our God really is. So I think the good news is if you are as frustrated by what he says as I am, then maybe we don't see the market as our God and we're halfway out, and that's good. Because I think the first bit is that we can criticize, that we can say, no, 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 you don't get to demand absolute obedience from me or from us. So now what we're going to do is look at some of the pieces of what this God does and how this God works. And what I would call, well, what the Pope called the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. What we can see is that the God of the economy, the God of the market, the religion of the market, has all the sacred trappings of a religion, and it operates in our culture as religions are expected to operate. It's just the broader public doesn't see that that's the case. So one of the things that the market economy has is rituals, liturgies. This is an interesting one. Each day on Wall Street begins with a simple liturgy. A presider stands at a podium and rings a bell. For the next 8 hours, exchanges occur that determine the well-being of the market for that day, that bring either hope or despair to the participants in the ritual. This experience of a bull market heaven or a bear market hell is indistinguishable in effect from revival's experience of being saved or damned. A simple economic exchange becomes something more than that within the ritual parameters of the Wall Street market. The day ends, of course, exactly as it began, with a ritual ringing of a bell. The stock market is the soul of capitalism, and capitalism is the soul of the nation. So, what are rituals? Rituals are the structures, the grammar, the language, the actions that give order and meaning to our lives. I always brush my teeth the same way. Why? I don't know. Maybe it saves me. I don't know. It's just how I do it. There's a way. And if I don't, everything is weird. It's just if I forget that I was supposed to. We set rituals because they help us make sense of life. And religious rituals are really potent ones. The rituals, the liturgies that we do help us understand who God is and what God is asking of us and what God is giving us. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the God of the market has rituals. There are other ones that we have. There is the appearance rituals. Scott Gustafson writes this, and I just thought this is a really interesting description. So the appearance rituals, showing up and telling us that all is well. When an economic crisis ensues, he writes, the president appears before the American flag and other symbols of state in the ritual attire we call a business suit. If the crisis is great, he will also be surrounded by other appropriately clad men, and some women, we believe, to be experts. These experts function as priests of the economy, whose religious sanction is always needed by political rulers. We are told we need not be anxious. The crisis is under control. As a matter of fact, we are told that some of the people on the stage actually predicted and expected the disaster and are ahead of the curve in protecting us because, in their wisdom, they saw it coming. Other rituals are the media explanations of what's happening. And Gustafson has an interesting take on this. It doesn't matter if the explanations are consistent with reality. What we need is the media to tell us, why did the market go down? Why did it go up? What's happening here? Tell me what the thing is. And he says it doesn't matter if they're consistent with reality. It doesn't matter if they make sense. All that matters is that someone explains it to us. Someone tell us that all is well with God, that nothing is wrong. There are rituals of our common life, such as the holiday shopping season, with its structured ads, the appearances of Santas and Christmas music. The order's the same every year. We argue that it's creeping earlier and earlier, but it is a ritualistic thing. Everything happens in an order. Everything happens as expected. We know that mid-November we're going to start seeing advertisements with snowfall and Christmas carols that were originally written, most of them anyway, unless it's the Rudolph stuff, most of them were written for the worship of the triune God. But all of a sudden they now disorient us because now they are given as part of the ritual to sell. So what this does is, through the rituals of the consumer market, we are reshaped. We are made consumers. We're not just people. We are taught what we need. We are taught why it will make us happy, which gets us to the second point, and that is that the God of the market has a gospel. Here's the gospel. Harvey Cox, in his book, The Market is God, describes the gospel this way. The gospel of the market is not a complicated one. True, it may be delivered in a staggering number of ways, but underneath the content is the same. It says simply, buy this and you will be happy. But because profit derives from the mass production of countless identical blouses, cars, and wristwatches, a certain interior uniformity of taste must be generated. This is going to scare you. The problem is that human beings are not the same. They reflect, or once did, a mishmash of wildly disparate preferences and desires. So the market God needs to transform people from what they once were into people prepared to receive and act on its message. They have to be born again. If I am to be convinced to buy something, I have to be changed. I have to be told why I need it, why it will make me happy, why my life will be better. It is the heart of the market God to change me so that I become a consumer, so that I keep the engine going. I find that deeply chilling. Cox even argues that the layaway system, in-store credit, and credit cards were invented to get people to think about things they never would have imagined buying before. People 150 years ago didn't even have mortgages on houses. I mean, this whole idea that you could borrow on credit to buy, the intention of that is to convince us to need things that we don't need, or that we didn't think we would want, or that we could afford. We aren't going to buy it because who's got the money? Well, you've got a credit card. Now you don't need the money. Now you can need and want many more other things. I got time. For my generation, I think we started to understand this in our guts at Christmas time. I would say that the generation that we're in now, and this was, we were before the frenzied tramplings of parents getting the new IT toy. I don't think our parents of my generation did that. But my friends and I understood this, my siblings and I understood this, that we were told this is what you need and want for Christmas. And you get what you need and want for Christmas, and 2 days later, you're bored with it. I didn't really, but somehow we were convinced that's what we had to have. There was a huge shift in the 19th century on Christmas giving based on what the market asked for. At the beginning of the century, it was considered not only acceptable but lovely to give homemade gifts, to cook things, to bake things, to do small little things. By the end of the century, people were being told, if you don't buy something store-bought, if you don't buy something manufactured, you don't really love that person. You're not really giving them what they want. So this is the kind of consumer the market God needs and loves and creates over time. And I would suggest that the gospel of the market God also carries with it a law. In the high holy days of the market's year, the 40 days or so before Christmas, we're saturated with the promises of the gospel. Buy these things and you will be happy. Buy these things for your loved ones and they will be happy, and they will love you even more. But because the market God must be fed, we also start hearing anxious voices from the priests on TV who are saying as the season progresses, consumer spending isn't what it needs to be. You're not doing your part. They start analyzing, are people out and buying things? Black Friday wasn't as big as it was before. What are we going to do? Stores aren't selling. Target's announcing that their sales are down. So this anxiety, the implication is clear. If you don't buy more things, it's your fault. The economy is failing. The market God is angry. Things are going bad. And you should have fixed it by buying more stuff. It has amazed me over the years how unchallenged this is in the news. I mean, it's just for 2 months. All we hear is, you got to get out and buy more stuff, guys. Because otherwise, this is all going down. It's all going south. So, if we don't get out there and overconsume, the health of our nation is at risk. The health of the world is at risk. The market god has a liturgical year. The market god has Black Friday, that's a high holy day. It begins the holy sacred season of the weeks before Christmas. Christmas itself is the highest of high holy days in the market year. But lesser festivals are like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day. Mother's Day is fascinating because it was actually started by somebody who, the first Mother's Day observance was a liturgy in a Methodist church, but it was also tied into Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, and it was a commercial thing from the beginning, which the founder, Anna Jarvis, 20-some years later, rebuked, hated. She tried to sort of end it's like, I wish I wouldn't have created this Mother's Day thing. It has now become this orgy of consumerism, and she hated it. But she couldn't undo what had been done. From the beginning, it was actually church-endorsed, consumerism. Gustafson suggests the highest of high holy days is not Christmas, it's Super Bowl Sunday. He said, that's when the advertising is most expensive. Churches don't even schedule events on Super Bowl Sunday. More parties happen on Super Bowl Sunday across our nation than do on any other day of the year except possibly New Year's Eve. So this is the market's year, and there is a flow to it, and we know it. And the most we will do, I'm sorry to say, is grouse that they're starting before Halloween now. I mean, okay, but wow, there's a bigger problem than just the Christmas decorations went up before Halloween. But we'll at least get irritated about that. What we're saying is, it's okay to inundate us with it after Thanksgiving. I mean, in my hometown, all the lights in the city streets went on Thanksgiving weekend. So that we knew the high holy days were upon us. The shopping season, everybody, get out your wallets and spend.
Pastor?
Yes.
Just to underscore Gustafson's and your point about Super Bowl Sunday, what gets all the attention? It's not the football game, it's the ads.
It's the ads and everything around it. You're right. The market has priests, theologians, prophets. Gustafson says it even has terrorists. We aren't going to really get into this, but we've already mentioned some of the priests, the experts who lead us through our rituals. Adam Smith is the great prophet. He's the Moses of the market. He gets cited, Keynes. And what people have noticed is, if you read the debates and diatribes between economic people, it is absolutely the same kind of thing as the theological schools and denominations within the Christian church. It's this class deriding this other class. There are things as heresies. You can't say that. That isn't the truth. The market acts theologically just the way the church does, and I don't mean that in a good way. It copies our bad stuff. The market god has sacraments. Money is the sacrament of the market god. It's the tangible thing that gives you grace. It's even a commanded thing. If you don't have money, you really have no value in this market, in this world. The poor have no value because they can't contribute. They can't buy stuff. They're not going to increase anybody's profits. So the poor are devalued not just because we don't care about them. They're devalued because they don't matter. That's why the Pope said it isn't that they're marginalized. They're not even a part of the society anymore. Not the society of the market god. So if you have money, you have grace. You have power. You are transformed. If you don't have money, you are excluded. Gustafson has a nice quote about what this is. A sacrament, he's a Lutheran. What's weird is Dwight knows him, and he used to be a Lutheran pastor, ELCA, and now he's like a financial advisor, and I'm thinking, so, and Dwight isn't sure either. We were talking about this, and so did he sell out to the whole thing? Or we just don't know. But he makes really good arguments, so I'm hoping not. But here's what Gustafson writes. A sacrament is a corporately recognized expression of subjective trust in the promises of a God. Money is the sacrament of the economy because it is an external expression that embodies our subjective trust in the economy's promises. Without such subjective belief, money would not work. Our faith makes the sacrament efficacious. And we can't go to the whole development, but it's a fascinating thing. When you look at the development of currency, you start with the barter system, then we have gold and silver, and now there's the dropping of the gold standard, everything is on paper. Now we don't even have paper and a page as much as just computer codes in servers and databases that is supposed to be money. Holy cow. That is all based on our belief that there's value to it. There is no intrinsic value to the dollars and the numbers that you get on your bank report, except that the whole economy and all of the people who worship the market god say, that has value. And you know what happens when they stop believing? That's when you get a depression. That's when you get a run on the bank. That's when you get people saying, we have no idea, we don't trust any of this. And you start papering your wall with this paper money. Because there is no there. The bulk of the economy survives on our faith in it.
One note, our faith does not make the sacraments efficacious. Does not.
Right. But I get what you're saying, Larry, but work with me on this one. What if we did not believe that money was effective? It would not be effective. And you're right, with the sacraments, but we do receive them in faith. There is a sense that our faith helps us at least grasp their promises. But you're right, from God's standpoint, the sacraments themselves are a gift from God that we don't create. But if we're working with this on this understanding, one of the things that Cox writes is, in the past couple of decades, observers of the market have noticed a dramatic change. The mature economies aren't producing as many ships or as much structural steel as they once did. Instead, much of the energy has shifted from manufacturing to the financial sector, which is now turning out more and more derivatives, options, futures, hedge funds, and a host of other paper documents and electronic impulses that some are still willing to call products, he puts in quotes. Globally, the financial economy has grown so massively that the value of financial assets, that is, all these derivatives, hedge funds, everything, now exceeds the actual global output of all goods and services, the part that is actually the real economy, by a factor of 10. So we have 10 times the value of what we were actually making out there being traded, sold, and it's all paper or computer things. There is no value. He looks at the foreign exchange trading. Values of foreign exchange trading and finance rose from 11 times the value of actual global trade in 1980 to 73 times in 2009. So in 2009, what was being traded was 73 times more valuable than the actual goods that it was supposed to be trading. So there isn't any support to this if it all collapses. In 2008, when the recession happened, Mary and I lost all the equity in our house. And it was a lot of money on paper. But the truth is, the so-called value of our home in 2007, before it, greatly exceeded what we'd paid for it. Astonishingly so. I remember looking at these appraisals and saying, how is our house worth that much more now than we haven't paid that much money in on our mortgage? We were paying it down and everything like that. We were making money like crazy on that equity. But it wasn't real money. It was someone else's idea of what our house might actually have been worth. And so what we lost, Mary disagrees with me on this part, by the way, what we lost wasn't actual money. I didn't think we ever had it. And Mary said, it looked pretty real to me. And I totally get what she's saying. As I said last week, you have to bear with me that genetically I just can't be bothered to care. But to me it was like, well, they made up that value anyway. All of the value that they said our house had, now that they say it doesn't have it, so we didn't. And so if the recessions hit, that's because people lose faith in their God's ability to bless them. The market God has temples, sacred spaces. Shopping malls are designed very carefully because they are holy spaces of the market. Gustafson writes this, architects of shopping malls are extremely mindful of each square foot of a shopping mall's sacred space. The sacred character of such mindfulness is revealed when one notes that there may be less difference between the designs of our indoor shopping malls and the architecture of individual churches. In both spaces, everything has its place. Shopping malls all have strategically located water fountains, sources of natural light, and trees. Light, water, trees, and other nature phenomena are used in a symbolic way by all religions. These trees, however, never shed their leaves, and they never die. They represent abundant life made possible by the economy and its markets. It is the Garden of Eden without the fall, the resurrection without the cross, spring and summer without fall and winter. And the chief architect, James Rouse, who created 60 of the first enclosed shopping malls, said he had the same goals as a church building. He said, the mall is the place where all people come together, rich and poor, old and young, black and white. It is the democratic, unifying, universal place which gives spirit and personality to the city. So we go to the temple and we worship the God of the market and we buy things because we have to. Because if we don't, the God will be angry and things will go wrong. The global market God has a global mission. Again, we don't have time to go into this in depth, but I'm going to give you some of the things that you can read out there. The global market is all about spreading to the whole world. Corporations have an urgency to spread wherever and however they can, which means they have to convert unbelievers. You don't need to wear your indigenous clothes. You don't need to eat the food that your ancestors ate and that you've grown and that you've taken care of. What you need to be happy is to wear what everyone else in the West is wearing. What you need to be happy is to eat KFC, to eat McDonald's, and we will provide that. Be like everyone else. Cox brilliantly sees the market's globalization as the reversal or the opposite of Pentecost. Economists speak of the Geist of the market, the spirit of the market, so an apt comparison. Except at Pentecost, the goal of the Holy Spirit was to fill the world with God's presence in all the world's diversity. When the disciples spoke in tongues, it wasn't that everybody spoke the same language. What they said was, we hear the good news in our own languages. That's what the gift of tongues was at the first Pentecost. All had their own languages, their own culture, their own diversity, and yet God was able to speak to them in that. And tell them of Christ Jesus and the resurrection and invite them to new life. Conversely, the God of the global market is the end of diversity, because as we said in the section on the gospel, it's more profitable to make the same thing for everybody. Mass marketing, assembly line, all these things we think of as good inexorably lead to the goal of making everyone the same. Mary and I talk about this all the time when we travel. We get out of an airport and we're driving to our hotel, and we could not tell you what city in America we're in because they are identical. Every single franchise that we left in Minneapolis, St. Paul lines the highway. Every hotel is the same. Every bank is, sometimes the bank names are slightly different. You just can't tell. I was really, really stunned when we went to Hawaii a few years ago. And coming out of the Honolulu airport, I don't know why, but I just thought maybe we could tell this was Hawaii, but you couldn't. It looked exactly like every other city that we have in our country. And it's really, really depressing when you see that abroad. But if you consider McDonald's, the whole business model of McDonald's is uniformity. A major advertising campaign used to tell you that a McDonald's hamburger will taste the same wherever you eat it. You don't have to worry that you're going to eat weird stuff. You can taste the same thing. Even in countries like India, where they had to make them out of goat, they still worked really hard to make it taste just like the hamburger you get. And it's a source of despair for me to come into a lovely town in Europe and see the golden arches saying, come to the temple and buy your French fries. Be happy. And I actually like McDonald's French fries. I mean, it's a complicated life in which we live. But the temples are everywhere, aren't they? You know, and America really got good at putting our temples everywhere. I mean, Disneyland, Gustafson has a long piece about how Disneyland is a pilgrimage site. And how, you know, that it's this whole, it's a demonstration of our faith in our life, and we have to make a pilgrimage to the great Disney. But we also are spreading those pilgrimage lights to France and everywhere else.
Pastor Holiday Inn once had a big media campaign in which the slogan was, the best surprise is no surprise.
Right, right. So, we're going to look next week at the challenges to our faith, the scripture challenges, and the life we have in Christ. There's good analysis of the contrast between what God in the scriptures asks of us and what the God of the market asks of us. But I thought it might be helpful today to end today by laying out some of the contrast that Harvey Cox points out as a way to close this section and get us thinking about next week. So the first contrast is related to Pope Francis's words we've already heard. The view of the person, the human being. The Pope says that the problem is that we no longer care about the human being. That the human being has no relevance to the God of the market. And so what Cox does is sort of lay out. So the biblical understanding of human beings, he reminds us, is we're mortal and we're aware of it. We will die. And we know we will die. And also we take responsibility for our actions and their impact. Or we don't, and the prophets tell us we need to. So the assumption in the scriptures is you're mortal, you're going to die, and you're accountable to your actions in one way, shape, or form. By contrast, in the market, the new human is the corporation. As the Pope has pointed out, corporations and their needs are the greatest good, the focus of the market, and the unassailable sacred cows. We don't get to challenge it, and now the Supreme Court has underlined it. As with everything in the market's purview, we don't get to criticize it, we don't get to challenge anything. And what Cox points out is, here's the two elements in the market's new person. First, the corporation lives forever. It can get reborn, it can get reincarnated, but there is no mortality. The corporation stays and thrives, and there is limited liability. That's the concept that we embrace. There's no accountability. Increasingly, legal decisions might place the blame on the corporation for malfeasance, but not a single human being is punished for those malfeasances. If you look at the crisis of 2008, those CEOs got paid millions of dollars, even though their companies were accused of rigging the market and doing all the things that they did. The corporation absorbs all of it, and there is no accountability to anyone. Cox reminds us of the story of Bhopal, India, and the chemical plant disaster in '84. 27 tons of a gas that's 500 times more toxic than cyanide blew out of the Union Carbide plant. 20,000 were estimated to have died. 120,000 were affected by this. The court thing has never been settled. And what happened is, Union Carbide was reincarnated. Dow bought them. And so Dow argued in court, we're not responsible for this crisis because it wasn't us. Union Carbide doesn't exist anymore. It is now reincarnated. It's a shapeshifter god, Cox says, like the trickster gods of old. You never know, you think you have a coyote and all of a sudden you have a deer. It's not what you thought it was. And so no one is held accountable. The second image is a potent one that ties together Pope Francis's concerns with the new realities, and I think might help us as we consider our path ahead. And as the Pope has said, making the market our God has radically altered our sense of what is good and what is valuable. We no longer value the individual human or even communities of humans. What matters is what makes money, what profits, what grows the economy. And Cox argues this is essentially the reverse Eucharist, which he kind of did with Pentecost. So he's looking at sort of these as mirror images. And this insight really struck me. So in our Eucharist, ordinary bread and wine contain God's presence. They are the body of Christ for us. Christ comes to us in earthly things. We pray and sing, made with human hands. And yet they are transformed into the life of God. And in these sacraments, God draws us into God's life and love. But Cox writes this: in the Mass of the Market's religion, a reverse process occurs. Things that have been held sacred are transmuted into interchangeable items for sale. So in our sacrament, earthly ordinary is transformed by God into extraordinary, into life-giving grace. In the Market's Eucharist, things that are sacred are transmuted into sale products, things that you can put on a table for sale. He goes on, land is a good example. And sure, you brought this up last week. For millennia, land has held various meanings, many of them numinous. It has been Mother Earth, ancestral resting place, holy mountain, enchanted forest, tribal homeland, aesthetic inspiration, sacred turf, and much more. But when the market Sanctus bell rings and the elements are elevated, all these complex meanings of land melt into one: real estate. At the right price, no land is not for sale. And that includes everything from the forefathers' burial grounds to the cove of the local fertility sprite. Look at our current attempts to sell our national parks, the Keystone Pipeline controversy, and more. This radical desacralization dramatically alters the human relationship to land. And the same happens with trees, water, air, space, and soon it is predicted the heavenly bodies. Here's the other example. At the high moment of the Mass, Cox writes, the priest says, "This is my body," meaning the body of Christ, and by extension, the bodies of all the faithful people. Christianity and Judaism both teach that the human body is made in the image of God. Now, however, in a dazzling display of reverse transubstantiation, the human body has become the latest sacred vessel to be converted into a commodity. The process began, fittingly enough, with blood. But now all bodily organs, kidneys, skin, bone marrow, sperm, the heart itself, can miraculously be changed into purchasable items, and those that are not already soon will be. Which is really frightening. And those are two examples, land and our bodies, of changing what is holy into what is for sale. So this is where I want to say we are. And the question is, how do we remain faithful in light of these things? How does our faith, our scripture, our relationship with God speak to our living in a market God's world? We'll talk about that next week. But I want to end where we began, with Martin Luther, and then we'll just see if you got thoughts and questions. So we're going to end where we started today. A God is that to which we are to look for all good, and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God is nothing else than to believe and trust in that one with your whole heart. As I've often said, it is the trust and faith of the heart alone that make both God and an idol. Anything on which your heart relies and depends, I say, that is really your God. So let's hold Luther in our heads and let's see if you have questions or thoughts in the next 9 minutes or something. See.
I think one of the most troubling things is the corporate merger between Christianity and the marketplace in the form of the prosperity gospel.
Right.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how that developed and whether it seems to be a particularly American thing. But what's the history of how that came about?
Yeah, I don't know the history of that, but I can tell you that I lost my pen. I can tell you that we will be talking about that next week in terms of what do the scriptures actually say. The verse that says, if you believe me, I will prosper you and give you all you need is where it comes from. I actually would have to do some research to figure out when it really started and took root in this country. But I'll come to that next week. I'm a little disturbed because it's a nice book. Mark it. I know. Jacques.
But it doesn't really matter.
Except Mary gave it to me when I was ordained.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, that's different.
Yeah.
It might actually follows up with what Steve was saying. Is like I think that it's easy for us to hear what you're saying and think, oh, the God of the economy is over here and it's bad and look at us, we should fight against it and that's good. But the danger then is that we say, oh, we're over here and we're good and we're fine.
Right.
When in fact, for many Christian communities that I have been a part of, and this one is better, but certainly not immune, it plays these mental gymnastics of we're okay and the God of the economy is bad, when in fact there's a dangerous intersection that says that, well, these things that I have are signs that God has blessed me.
That's right.
And that fits with the prosperity gospel idea. And I think, Luther, I pulled it up here so I can have it. It says, his quote that you had up there, it says, there are some who think that they have God and everything they need when they have money and prosperity.
That's right.
Having God, having money, and being well taken care of are a sign that you're in a good place with God.
That's right.
And the flip side of that, then, the danger in looking at it is, if you don't have money and property,
Right.
you're wrong with God.
Right.
And we think we see that attitude with the poor. I've seen that so many times before. It's kind of back to that question in the gospel with the blind man and the Pharisees of, the blind man and the Pharisees' question to Jesus is, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's blind?
Right.
And we look at the poor the same way.
Right.
We say, well, if they're poor, what's wrong with them?
Right.
Why are they not right with God? If they would just get God, then everything would be okay with their life.
I actually would say the frightening thing about all this analysis to me is how deeply obedient I am to the market God. I mean, I don't come out of this saying, we're on this side and the market God is over here. What concerns me is how often my life acts in obedience to what the market God wants. And my hope is that we can break free of that. But we have to name that point that means that prosperity is not a sign that God is with us or that God isn't with us or whatever. Somebody had their hand up over here.
I think I would say human services have changed depending upon the government grants. Who our clients can be, how their description in order to serve them in human services.
Yes.
And one thing that I experienced personally was in teaching at school, my school experience, was there was a period of time where it began, where I had to look across and determine what the ethnic description was of my students. And that too was dependent on government money.
Right. Yes.
And just that whole change of
Whether you can care for somebody is whether you've got, if they're valuable enough to receive a grant.
And we moved in human services in a different way. It became determined by government description.
That's fascinating. Al over here and then Chandler over here.
I probably won't do justice to the eloquence of the high priest at the time, but I'm reminded soon after 9/11, we're going to attack somebody, you go shopping.
Yeah. That's how we're going to make it up. Yeah, Chandler.
There's a certain amount of complicity with market God to just exist, to pay your mortgage, to go buy groceries.
Right.
I mean, I caught myself in the vestry meeting this past month thinking with my business hat on. Because that's what I do every day.
Right.
You know, when I go to work, I'm not paid to be compassionate. You know, and to,
There's no profit in compassion.
Right, there's a compassionate person. I look out for the employees that I work with. I look out for the clients that I work for. But there's that twist. If you want to get ahead, you also have to look out for the company's interests, and that distills down to the bottom line.
That's right. And it's very complicated. Mary, and then I think Don.
Well, it's interesting that, you've been talking about new commandments in a way. And Jesus says, I give you a new commandment. For me, I hear it in walk by new and improved, because it means less of the same old thing and higher price.
So we have new, yeah. Don.
Not to challenge the place of the market in each person, but on a day-to-day basis, there's a second God. It seems to me it's called entertainment.
Sure.
And could you say that?
So he said in day-to-day basis, there's a second God, and that's called entertainment.
Yeah.
Although that's in the pantheon of the market too,
Well, maybe.
It's unbundled with this
you pay for
alongside.
experiences.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Just check it out on a day-to-day basis of what seems to have more impact on us
Right,
in occupying.
right.
I mean, when you mentioned the Super Bowl,
Mm-hmm.
I don't care whether it's the ads or the game.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be entertained.
Right. Sure, and then Dwight.
You just mentioned the Super Bowl. Sports in general is the whole subject in itself. But that's not what I really wanted to say. What I wanted to say is how we use money as a way of equating with the sacred. Somebody is hurt. That's a sacred thing. Well, how much is that worth? And you adjudicate it in terms of dollars.
Right.
What's the judgment of that? And a corporation could say, yeah, we could throw these people under the bus, we'll get sued, but we can afford it because there's this whole equation.
There's a calculus.
That's a calculus
Right.
of the value in terms of dollars.
That's right.
For whatever these irreplaceable sacred things.
Right. Wait.
Yeah, this certainly doesn't dispute anything that you've been saying, but what's the most troubling aspect of all of this for me is the way that we don't see the connection between the challenge of the God of the altar, or the altar at Wall Street, and the God of Jesus. I was with a group of Catholic theologians just before the Pope issued Laudato Si, in which he was supposed to be talking about the environment and the challenges that way, which of course came after the joy of the gospel.
Right.
And these are really good theologians. They're very thoughtful and they're nice guys. In that case, they were all guys.
All guys.
And they were lamenting that the sort of pre-news of this encyclical, and saying, almost in exactly these words, why can't the Pope just stick to the matters of faith? As though all of this is somehow, that faith is divorced from it. And that's what we have to see. I mean, Luther will challenge it, but that doesn't sort of go to their theory that, yeah, you need to cling to God, but boy, the market, and I remember, was it John Paul II, I think, was criticized as not being an economist. He can't possibly speak to matters of faith about the economy.
Right.
That split, that really nasty
Don't
sort
tell
of,
us what we can and can't
well,
do.
and what that suggests is that, it actually confirms probably Scott and Cox's stuff that these guys really are high priests. I mean, it's Gnosticism in an absolute sense. That, the Chicago school knows everything.
Right.
And the fact that the divinity school is next door rings no irony for them at all.
Al.
He left and I didn't have a chance to say, we need businessmen in the vestry, and we need businessmen in banks. And business can be profitable and can be compassionate. We have to look into the hearts of boardrooms and CEOs and the hearts of shareholders. Because unless businesses are profitable, they can't be compassionate, but they need to weigh that balance. And that's the message that we have to do. I mean, we can vote with our pocketbooks in this church.
Yeah, I think that the answers that seem to be emerging from some of these voices is just that the market is how we do business. So the question is, how are we faithful? We can't be excluded as people of faith from talking about it. And is there a faithful path here? Is there a way that we can walk? And I think that's the challenge for us. And the first step for me was just recognizing the depth of the problem so that we can say, okay, so now what's a faithful path going forward? How do we deal with that? It would be, I don't know what would happen. Yeah, I mean, I said last week everything's on the table, but I don't think it's on the table that you end the global economy. I mean, it's sort of, it's going to be going. Susan, and I think this will be the last one.
Okay, just briefly, it reminds me of something that I read in Joseph Campbell's book, The Power of Myth, where he said, you can tell from our cities what the core of our grounding and the centering of our lives is by the tallest buildings. At one time it was always the churches that were the tallest buildings, but now it's the bank buildings.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. We'll come back and we'll hear from Jesus next week.